السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Inshallah ta'ala, tonight we'll talk about the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah and some of the virtue and rulings related to these 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. And inshallah ta'ala, tomorrow we'll talk about some of the rulings related to the udhiyah, or the qurbani, or the hadi, the slaughtering on the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, inshallah ta'ala. These days, and with regards to their virtue, there are ayat of the Quran and hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that talks about this. But it requires for us, the speaker and the listeners, to have a pure heart, a heart that is truthful with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we sincerely want to know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, and then we seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fulfill that in the most perfect way, to the best of our ability, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed His favor upon this ummah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, being the ummah upon the haqq, upon the truth. There's no other nation, there's no other way that is accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except the way of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. وَمَنْ يَبْتَغِي غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامِ دِينًا فَلَنْ يُقْبَلَ مِنْهُ وَهُوَ فِي الْآخِرَةِ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. Whoever seeks other than the deen of Islam as a religion, it's not going to be accepted from him, and he will be in the day of resurrection from the losers. So the final revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and the actions of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and his speech, the Quran and the Sunnah, and the way of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, and the Tabi'een and Tabi'i Tabi'een, is a miraculous thing in itself. It shows us whoever wants to truly seek the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he would find it perfectly explained for us. So we just need to have truthfulness and to seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To make it short, because of the time, inshallah ta'ala, first of all, it's the great favor from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon this ummah that it have mawasim. Mawasim, that means seasons of goodness, seasons of virtue, that the deeds are multiplied, seasons that are better than other days on the normal days. Then there's a great wisdom behind this. And this fadl and this bounty is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, to increase the rewards and to elevate the levels. And for people to, it's really these types of days and seasons of virtue, it revives one's iman. And it generates more and more of the good deeds, in which a person would strengthen his iman to the next season, and so on. And these 10 days of Dhul Hijjah, that it starts with today's Maghrib, many people, they are really not given it its importance because of many different reasons, one of which is it's not widespread among them, the virtue of these 10 days. It's before it is just normal days, and so people are not prepared maybe emotionally to witness these 10 days. But as far as the evidences are concerned, especially the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, it shows that these are the best 10 days ever. And there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ reported by Ibn Hibban and others, which is a sound hadith, that أفضل أيام الدنيا أيام العشر, the best days of this dunya. And the Prophet ﷺ said the best 10 days, or the best days of this world, is the first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. So it's even better than the last 10 days of Ramadan, because it's as 10 days. And the 10 days of Ramadan, the virtue of it is in seeking Laylatul Qadr. Laylatul Qadr, of course, nothing is the like of it as a particular night. And some said it's the days versus the night. The nights of Ramadan is more virtue. The days are more virtue in the first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. But the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, when it talks about 10 days, There's no like of these 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. So, and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, as we will see, inshallah ta'ala, there's no like also of this hadith when it shows the virtue and the superiority of the good deeds and exalting these 10 days. It was said that also these 10 days were known to the nations before. You know, it was said in the tafsir of Surah Al-A'raf when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about Musa alayhi salam, وَعَدَنَا مُوسَى 30 لَيْلَةً وَأَتْمَمْنَاهَا بِعَشْرٍ فَتَمَّ مِيقَاتُ رَبِّي 40 لَيْلَةً. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he met Musa alayhi salam for 30 nights, and then we completed it with, it was said in the tafsir of the ayah that it's what is meant by that is the month of Dhul Qa'dah and then the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. And this was reported by Ibn Abbas and others. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swear by these 10 days in Surah Al-Fajr. وَالْفَجْرِ وَلَيَالٍ عَشْرٍ وَالشَّفْعِ وَالْوَتْرِ. So, Imam Jarir al-Tabari narrate more than one narration from many of the Mufassirin, whether it's Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma and others, that this is the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. It's also the Ayyam Ma'lumat mentioned in Surah Al-Hajj, وَيَذْكُرُ اسْمَ اللَّهِ فِي أَيَّامٍ مَعْلُومَاتٍ, for the people in Hajj to make remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in known days, which is the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. In these 10 days is the day of Arafah, is the day of An-Nahr, is the days of Ayyam al-Tashriq, and that's why it's said to be the most virtue of days, because all of the different pillars of Islam is established in these 10 days. You have the Tawheed, of course, which is one of the shi'ar or the slogan of these days is the Tawheed, and as it will come with the takbir of these days. You have the salawat are established at all times, and fasting, which is also recommended in these days, but fasting the month of Ramadan is a pillar of Islam, of course. Giving charity, Hajj is established in these days. So because of that, these days Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exalted them. The ayah اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا was revealed in these days. On that day I completed for you your religion, perfected for you my favor, and pleased for you to have the religion of Islam as your religion, which was revealed in the day of Arafah. And the virtue of the day of Arafah is something else by itself. With the great virtue and the great deeds to be established in it, whether people are in Hajj or not. The hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that we probably heard many times, that it's an amazing hadith which shows the virtue of these days, where the Prophet ﷺ, he said, ما من أيام العمل الصالح فيهن أحب إلى الله من هذه الأيام. يعني أيام العشر. There is no days that the deeds in them are more beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than these days, meaning the days of the 10 of Dhul Hijjah. So they asked the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, وَلَا الْجِهَادُ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. He said, not even al-jihad fi sabilillah, except one case, إِلَّا رَجُلًا خَرَجَ بِمَالِهِ وَنَفْسِهِ وَلَمْ يَرْجِعْ مِنْ ذَلِكَ بِهِ. Except a man that he went out with his wealth and his own self, and he did not return with any of these. That means he died for the sake of Allah, and he spent all of his wealth in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the only action, if it's done in other than these 10 days of Dhul Hijjah, is more in rewards. Other than that, the days of the Dhul Hijjah, the first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah, the good deeds in it is much better than the same or the like of these deeds in other than the days of Dhul Hijjah. Of course, the fard is the fard, the obligation is the obligation. So no one is to say, for example, if I made dhikr in these 10 days is better than salatul fard in other than the 10 days, or fasting in the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah is more virtue than the fasting of the month of Ramadan. Of course not. It refers to the optional acts of worship, but also the obligations done in these 10 days is more virtue than the obligations done in the rest of the year, like salawatul fard and so on. But mainly the optional acts of worship. And that's why it's very stressed in these 10 days to do as much as we can of actions to perfect our obligations, to stay away from haram, of course, and to do more and more of the good deeds. So fasting in these days is more in rewards than fasting in other than these days. Giving charity in these days is more in rewards than giving charity in and other than these 10 days. The salah, the recitation of the Quran, the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so on. That's why it's what needs to be done here. And there are physical things needs to be mentioned, and we need to have the purification of our hearts, that it would get us steadfast to do the good deeds in these counted days, only 10 days. So to have this determination in one's heart, to seek rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we have in these days the establishment of Hajj. Those who are going for Hajj, or those who went for Hajj, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed His favor upon them, in which they have the virtue of the place where they're in. You know, when you have the best of days, which is the days of Dhul Hijjah, you add to it the best of places being in Mecca, the best place ever on the face of earth. So it gives you both the best of time, the best of places. So they have more virtue more than anyone else. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He knows the intentions of everyone. And for those who were not able to make it for Hajj, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful. When we talk about the ta'abbud, or worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these 10 days, this is basically what the hadith implies clearly, that the deeds are more beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these 10 days more than any other day. So therefore, doing acts of worship, and the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, when they heard this, they put so much effort in these 10 days in matters of ibadah. And the ibadah in these days, whether it's a ibadah that is in general, it's always virtue, like the 5 daily salah, like the recitation of the Quran, like these types of actions, the night prayer, it's to do more and more of it in these days. And also there's specific acts of worship that is specific for these days, which is like the takbir, and we'll talk about that also inshallah ta'ala. But to be encouraged, it's important to know how the early generations of Islam used to act in these 10 days. Sa'id ibn Jubayr, for example, from the Tabi'een, from the students of Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, once these 10 days would enter, he would, as it was said about him, كان يجتهد اجتهادا شديدا حتى ما يكاد يقدر عليه. He would exert himself and struggle so much that nobody was able to do the like of what he does. And he says, he used to say, لا تطفئوا سروجكم ليالي العشر. Do not turn off your lights in the night of Al-Ashr, which is the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah, meaning to be busy with the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he would wake up everyone to make suhoor for the fasting of the day of Arafah, which is a special reward, of course, in fasting the 9th of Dhul Hijjah. And when it comes to fasting, they used to fast these days. And there's no specific evidence where the Prophet ﷺ used to fast specifically for these days, except the hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha, that the Prophet ﷺ used to fast in the days of Dhul Hijjah. But it's part of what is virtue to be done in these days. And fasting, siyam, as the Prophet ﷺ, he said to Abu Darda, عليك بالصيام فإنه لا عدل له. Keep on fasting, because fasting, there's no like of it in rewards. So if you fast the entire 9 days, because the 10th is not permissible to fast it, this is a great deed. So you don't need a specific evidence that the Prophet ﷺ would always fast these days. And we have from the companions radiallahu anhum, like Umar radiallahu anhu, for example, he would make up the days of Ramadan in the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah because of its virtue. And they would say that he would not do it in Shawwal, for example, and which is an evidence of having optional fasting before you fulfill the obligatory fast. It's because of the virtue of these days. He wants to make up the days that if he broke his fast in Ramadan for a valid reason, they want to make up these days in the most virtuous of days, which is the days of the Hajj. So and others. So this is definitely something to be established. And the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, it's some of the ulama, they said it's weak, but again, we don't need to have a very specific hadith about the virtue of specifically fasting, because the Prophet ﷺ praised the good deeds in general. And some said that this was before the Prophet ﷺ establishing the virtue of these 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. So when it comes to, again, the actions, and showing that these days are the most virtuous of days, and certain things are forbidden also, and the Hajj is subject, the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these 10 days has a special virtue, because these are days of takbir. And the takbir, or saying Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah, Allahu Akbar, wa lillahi alhamd, is something that is very specific in these days. So the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in general, as we heard in the verses, istighfar, tahleel, tahmeed, takbir, the morning and the evening adhkar, and so on, and specifically the takbir. And the takbir is of two types. There is takbirul mutlaq and takbirul muqayyad. The takbir mutlaq, that means at all times. And al-muqayyad, the takbir that is linked to the 5 daily salah, that you would say them right after the salawat. The takbir mutlaq, once Maghrib time starts, which is tonight, the takbir is one of the most virtue of actions, is to say takbir all the way to Salatul Maghrib of Ayam al-Tashriq, the 13th of Dhul Hijjah, to make takbir at all times, during the day, during the night, and to raise your voice. And this is one of the sunan, one of the ways of the Prophet ﷺ that is being ignored by many. And because it's more stressed when people are witnessing, right? So when you're sitting alone, you're making takbir, yes. But it's more virtue in the presence of people. Meaning when you are in the masjid, on your way to, if you're walking in the streets and there are people in the markets, and this is how the Sahaba radiallahu anhum used to do. As Imam Bukhari mentioned this in his Mu'allaqat, and others were Abdullah ibn Umar and Abu Huraira radiallahu anhum. They would walk in the market, فَيُكَبِّرَانِ, they would make takbir and raise their voice with the takbir in the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. وَيُكَبِّرُ النَّاسُ بِتَكْبِيرِهِمَا, so the people would make takbir by their takbir. So this text or this narration shows that they would intentionally go to the market to make takbir, so that people would make takbir in the markets. So that means it's something that they would make sure that it's done, especially in the presence of people. This is al-mutlaq, that means at all times. Al-muqayyad, which is attached to the salawat, and that starts from Salatul Fajr on the day of Arafah. Salatul Fajr on the day of Arafah, which is the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, after each salah is to say the takbir. Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah, Allahu Akbar, wa lillahi alhamd. And to be repeated all the way to the Asr Salah of the last days of Ayam al-Tashriq, which is the 13th. And if a person misses the Salah, for example, comes late, it is from the Sunnah once he finishes the Salah that he makes his own takbir. So this is with regards to the takbir. And the sigha, as we heard, which is Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah, Allahu Akbar, like this, or Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah, Allahu Akbar, wa lillahi alhamd. Right? So sometimes 3, sometimes 2. And it's from reviving the sunnah, to do it again in the masajid, in the homes, and in the streets. And this is not from the riya, this is not showing off, this is from reviving the sunnah. So when you do this, you're reviving the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and people would declare this. Do it in front of people, do it among people, so that people would do the same thing. And of course, teaching the people, because this is one of the things to be established. When it comes to reciting the Quran in these days, is a special virtue to it. And that's how the early generations of Islam used to read lots of Quran in these days. So reading Quran and making sure that, and people are in level when it comes to reading the Quran. Some people are more fluent in reading Quran than others. So each according to the best of their ability. So if you, someone that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed his favor upon to learn the Quran, memorize the Quran, then have, as many times that you finish the Quran in these days. So being busy, more time of reciting the Quran, in these days, this is something that is meant. So the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's wazifa, it's a job that is really specific in these days. The takbir and of course the tasbih and the tahmeed, fixing our 5 daily salah, fasting, and you make these as jobs of these days. The salah, establishing the obligatory salah in the most perfect way in the masjid in jama'ah, doing more and more of the optional acts of worship. The sujood in these days is more virtue than the sujood in any other time. So when you make salah, you make lots of sujood. As the Prophet ﷺ, he said, عليك بكثرة السجود لله فإنك لا تسجد لله سجدة إلا رفعك الله بها درجة وحط عنك بها خطيئة. Keep on making sujood to Allah, because indeed every time you make one sajda, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will elevate you a level and He would expiate from you a sin. And reciting the Quran, and the virtue of reciting the Quran, one letter is equal to 10 rewards. The night prayer, and to be one of the things that you would see among the early generations of Islam, and I hope you're with me, inshallah ta'ala, and ulama mentioned this, is to be greedy with your time. To be very greedy with your time. Don't waste your time. Don't be so generous with your time that you wasted, but rather to take advantage of it by doing the things that brings the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to establish these meanings of adhkar in our hearts. When you say subhanallah, you're glorifying Allah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no deficiency. When you say Allahu Akbar, that means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Akbar is the greatest from all things. If anyone is great, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is greater. If it's your actions, if it's yourself, if it's your job, if it's whatever there is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Akbar. He's the greatest subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, our hearts need to be attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And when you do these types of adhkar, when you're busy with the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're ransoming yourself from the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You are doing deeds that is more virtue than any other deeds, and other than these days, even jihad fi sabilillah. And to repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to seek forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because sins prevents these virtues to be established in the most perfect way. As we said, those who are making Hajj, the speech is a specific thing for them, because one of the actions that are virtue in these days, of course, is to make Umrah, is to be present in Mecca waiting for Hajj. And the actions that are done in Hajj on the 8th and the 9th and the 10th and the days of Ayyam al-Tashriq, one of the things that needs to be, be aware of, that, and we'll talk about the rulings of al-Udhiyah or the Hadi or the slaughtering tomorrow, inshallah ta'ala. But whoever intended to slaughter, as the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in Imam Muslim and others, من أراد أن يضحي وراء هلال عشر ذي الحجة فليمسك فلا يأخذن من شعري وظفري. Whoever wants to make udhiyah, whoever wants to make qurbani and slaughter, and he saw the hilal of the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah, then let him withhold. He should not take anything of his hair or his nails. He should not cut his hairs or nails till he slaughter the animal. And this is for the one that is intended to slaughter. So for every household, there is a goat or sheep, for example. So the head of the household is the one to abstain from cutting his hair or nails. The wife doesn't, the children, they don't, unless the wife, for example, wants to herself to purchase an animal to slaughter, then the hadith applies to her. So it's for the one that purchased it, is to not take anything of his hair and his nails. When it comes to the ikhtilaf of the ulama, which is not necessarily something good that we always talk about it, but it's, if you're living in an environment where you might find people not really aware of this, or they might say that it's permissible, this might cause people to call each other sinners, for example. No, the ulama have differences of opinions in this. Some of the ulama, they said it's permissible because of other evidences where the Prophet ﷺ, when he went for Hajj, he didn't do that, or there's no specific thing about it. So Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, they said it's permissible. Imam Shafi'i, he said it's makruh. Madhab Imam Ahmad, he said it's not permissible because of this hadith. So it doesn't have to be that a person is a follower of this madhab or so. The hadith is very clear, straightforward. If you have the intentions to slaughter, do not take anything from your hair or your nails. The one that again is going to purchase the animals. And it's from when he start or having the intention. So if you had the intentions before, if you have the intentions now, then at time of Maghrib, no hair to be cut, no nails to be cut till the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. But if you're not sure yet, you're not sure if you're going to slaughter or not, then once you make that decision, then you abstain from the hair and the nails. What's the wisdom behind it? The ulama talked about this, but we don't really need to know. It's sufficient that the Prophet ﷺ said that to us. Whether it's imitating the people of Hajj, whether it's exalting these days, whether it's going back to our own fitrah and pure nature that many people get it corrupted. So it's, this is sufficient for us to be upon this because the Prophet ﷺ, he commanded us. The ulama, they always talk about the actions, the certain actions to be done in these days. But as I said, it's all the good deeds. There's no specific deed except the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is mentioned specifically in these days. But any good deeds is virtue. Any good deeds is virtue, and people should do the best they can to establish this in their hearts and in their actions. And the deeds done by the heart, the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the hope for the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all of these good deeds and the ikhlas and the sincerity and the fact that the person is helped to do good deeds in these days is a great favor from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for us. When it comes closer to these days, inshallah ta'ala, we'll talk about it, that the fasting of the day of Arafah expiates the sin of a previous year and the present year. And the virtue of the day of Al-Nahr, which is the best day of the year, and the same thing with the day of Arafah, where the sins are forgiven, whether people are in Hajj or not. If a person is able to pray Fajr and stay in the masjid to sunrise, as the Prophet ﷺ used to do so, and to pray to Rak'ah, you get the rewards of Hajj and Umrah complete, being kind to others, giving charity, being kind to the parents, doing all kinds of actions of goodness towards the parents. This is something that is virtue. Because of exalting what the Prophet ﷺ he said, and what mentioned even in the verses of the Quran. And as we heard Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swear by these days. So if you truly love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you should have the concern of how can I do the best of the deeds in these days. And that's why when we reflect upon the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, مَا مِنْ أَيَّامٍ الْعَمَلُ الصَّالِحُ فِيهِنْ, there's no days, the good deeds in them is more beloved to Allah. So the good deeds is what's done sincerely for the sake of Allah, and it's according to the way of the Prophet ﷺ. And more beloved to Allah, that means it shows those who have the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would do the most beloved actions to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you claim that you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's, as we said, the relationship we have is to be in ibadah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is how a person becomes among those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala love. Not by feelings, not by claiming things, but rather with actions, by following the way the Prophet ﷺ. The more the person would do this, the more Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would make them among those who are beloved to Allah. And the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, وَمَا تَقَرَّبَ إِلَيَّ عَبْدِي بِشَيْءٍ أَحَبَّ إِلَيَّ مَا افْتَرَضْتُ عَلَيْهِ. The obligations comes first, that's the most beloved deeds to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then to do the optional acts of worship in a consistent manner till Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves the person. We'll talk about the udhiyah as we said, but some people, they think that it's part of the virtue is to make udhiyah or hajj or qurbani for the Prophet ﷺ. This is actually innovation in the deen. There's no such a thing. The Sahaba radiallahu anhum never done something like this. You can slaughter on someone's behalf, yes, if it's someone that died or someone that is present and seeking rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for. But the Sahaba radiallahu anhum never done something like that to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. The Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam is in no need of our good deeds to be done. So it's not something that has been established among the early generations of Islam. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the reality of this and to make us among those who are guided and to guide us to do the good deeds in these days. And we'll continue inshallah ta'ala tomorrow with the ahkam of the udhiyah or the hadi. And for those who are going for hajj also, inshallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for them and accept their deeds. And we'll talk about hajj and the rulings of hajj also still inshallah ta'ala in the coming days. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us witness it. And we'll meet inshallah ta'ala tomorrow. Sallallahu alaihi wa sallam wa baraka ala Muhammad wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.